So we have a pretty full agenda today. So for today's session, Brandon and I are going to talk through the Adaptation Planning Grant Program. As you all may know, we released the program guidelines for public comment on January 3rd, and they are now live on the website. We'll share that link in the chat. Some of you were quite engaged with us in the first round, and we also have some new faces. So to make the most of this space, we're going to start by giving everyone a reminder of the program background. We'll talk through the main sections of the guidelines and the application process. Throughout, we'll also note areas that we've changed in the second round. Some of these key changes included clarifications throughout, no real substantive changes to the program. We also have an introduction of technical assistance for qualifying applicants, introduction of AB 590, which includes advanced payments for 501c3 applicants. And then once we talk through the guidelines, we'll open it up for Q&A if folks have questions that come up. And then we'll also make space for any public comments. We have the call scheduled from 10 to 11:30, but we might not use that full time. So you might get some time back on your calendar. And if you need additional time to develop any comments or questions, we have several other ways to engage that we'll share at the end. Now we'll get into some background for the program. So current state law requires that considerations for climate change and associated risk be integrated into general plans through SB 379, climate adaptation plans through SB 1035, local coastal programs with further incentives to integrate adaptation into local and multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans. These plans guide the development of long-term community vision, infrastructure investments, community health and safety, emergency response, and hazard mitigation, as well as economic development. Recent reports have found that many jurisdictions lack the capacity, the resource, and the funding to make these updates. So in part, APGP was brought about to address some of these gaps. The 2021 and 2022 Budget Acts invested $54 billion in climate, and this current proposed budget this year maintains $48.3 billion of that funding. The legislation specifically authorized our ICARP to develop 3 new grant programs to provide direct funding to support local, regional, and tribal adaptation planning and infrastructure efforts throughout California. So today we are really focused on APGP, but I wanted to talk briefly about the 3 programs that were funded under the ICARP portfolio, especially since the HEAP program, their first round of funding, will overlap with APGP round 2. So the Regional Resilience Program aims to support local, regional, and tribal entities in regional scale climate resilience solutions. They also just awarded $21 million to 16 projects starting this year. So we're really excited to see those projects get underway. The Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program will fund planning and implementation projects to reduce the impacts of extreme heat and build community resilience. The program will build a framework for change to invest in local, regional, and tribal projects that strengthen communities that are vulnerable to heat. And then lastly, the Adaptation Planning Grant Program supports local, regional, and tribal communities engaging in integrated climate adaptation planning. We're going to share in the chat some more resources, mainly the websites, to learn more about the other programs under the ICARP portfolio. So we wanted to briefly recap some of the public engagement that we've undertaken to date. So throughout 2022 and 2023, the ICARP team conducted statewide series of virtual listening sessions, draft guideline workshops, application workshops, office hours, interviews, and we also continue to gather feedback from unawarded applicants through debrief sessions. So in that, this is kind of a summary of all the different areas where we got feedback from folks. And we're going to share in the chat some links to our engagement summary, which was an initial summary collecting all the feedback that we received. We're also going to share a link to the public comment summary. So that is all the changes that we made from the draft round one guidelines to the final guidelines. You'll see we received 273 unique comments and made over 1,500 edits to the round one draft guidelines. And that's what ended up being the final guidelines. And then we also just collected feedback from participants in the program, whether awarded, unawarded, or just people that engage with the programs. And that has all informed sort of where we landed for round two. Some of the main themes that we gathered through the engagement were for participants for us to really adapt eligible costs and eligible activity sections to meet the needs of applicants, their organizations, and the communities that they serve. The next is really to connect planning grant activities to implementation funding opportunities. We heard a lot of feedback because this is specifically just a planning program, not wanting to see plans just sit on the shelf. And so what could we do at the program end and build into the program to connect folks to implementation infrastructure funding down the line? Really to increase accessibility of the grant application process. And that looked like a lot of different things. So through extending the application word counts, adding additional clarification and guidance around the letters of support, partnerships, and the budget information. So you'll see a lot of those edits and changes reflected in our round two. And we'd also love to hear from you today if we missed the mark in any way. If there are areas that still need clarification that we can make edits for the final guidelines that will be live in February. So here's just a sense of the engagement for our round one. Brandon created this with our climate services team. So you'll see the distribution of applicants per county. We're also going to share in the chat a link to the awarded applications from round one to give you a sense of who was funded through our first round. But you'll see the distribution. So you'll see the purple dots are the ones that were the intent surveys that were submitted. The blue dots were of those intent surveys who submitted the full application. And the green dots, you'll be able to see the distribution of awarded projects. And now I'll hand it over to Brandon, who's going to give you an overview of the program.
Thanks, Abby. I think I'm hearing feedback. Okay, great. Yeah, so the Adaptation Planning Grant Program is essentially an initiative, a funding initiative with multiple rounds to support local, regional, and tribal adaptation planning in the face of climate change here in California. In round one, we successfully awarded approximately $8 million across 13 incredible projects. And you can see the profile of those projects on our website. The grants ranged from $150,000 to $650,000, which reflects the diversity and scale of these initiatives supported through the APGP. And then looking ahead to round two, which is the round that we're all here to discuss, we are excited to announce $9.5 million in available funding scheduled to be distributed this year. One of the great advantages of the Adaptation Planning Grant Program is that we do not require match funding, and we sort of try, and you'll see through the guidelines that we understand the unique challenges of our communities, and we want to make the process of granting and specifically climate adaptation as accessible as possible and flexible to meet those varying needs across the state. And secondly, this round, we also have technical assistance and advanced payment is also available for qualifying entities. Next slide, please. So the APGP is all about funding climate adaptation planning specifically. It's not just funding, but we're also trying to foster an inclusive and flexible grant program. One of the program's key goals is to enhance accessibility and diversity. So through that, we aim to minimize barriers for applicants And we're dedicated to ensuring that both applicants and awardees represent a broad spectrum of geographic and economic and demographic diversity. We also prioritize vulnerable communities and a vulnerable communities centered approach. We prioritize the unique needs of vulnerable communities, which includes an all-risk approach to adaptation planning and preparing communities for various climate change impacts. And we encourage community preparedness, which is also crucial in the face of cascading and compounding climate impacts. We emphasize integrated infrastructure planning. A significant focus is placed on the integration of social and physical infrastructure planning. This involves addressing cross-sector issues that intersect with various climate risks. For instance, we encourage our applicants to look at transportation, economic stability, housing, natural resource management, hazard mitigation, public infrastructure, and healthy food access in an integrated way, through an integrated lens. And by doing so, it's our understanding that we prepare our communities for multifaceted impacts of climate change. Our next goal is to build community capacity for resilience. Another critical goal here is just to enhance the statewide capacity for adaptation and resilience planning. So we think of ourselves and our applicants as doing this through providing technical support, facilitating peer-to-peer learning, establishing communities of practice, promoting information sharing, which we believe empowers communities with the knowledge and resources needed to adapt effectively to climate change. And then lastly, but not least, we are really aiming to elevate equity in the planning process. So emphasizing equity through all points and phases of the planning process will really help us all prioritize fair access to community investment benefits and privileges. And ultimately, funding will be directed to those most disadvantaged. And we support projects that address those historical disparities, our ultimate goal being to create a more equitable future for all. Next slide, please. So here's our timeline, our tentative timeline for round two, with awards you'll see at the bottom being announced in the summer of 2024. So this summer, as you can see, round two draft guidelines are currently under development, with this public comment period having opened on January 3rd and extending through February 2nd. We hope that that gives folks ample time after the holidays to review the draft guidelines and hopefully apply with us in the spring. So eligible applicants and activities. For eligible applicants, we have local public entities, California Native American tribes, community-based organizations, which include but are not limited to 501c3 nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, philanthropic organizations, foundations, and other organizations with a history of representing vulnerable communities. Some ineligible applicants would include for-profit entities and other state agencies. We'll discuss this a little bit later in the core project components, but there should be a minimum of one co-applicant in addition to the lead applicant for each project. More than one co-applicant is encouraged. And again, we'll kind of talk through the nitty-gritty of applicants and partnerships later. For eligible activities, the emphasis is ultimately on planning. We have a broad host of activities, a broad view on what types of activities will be eligible. But ultimately, you can kind of look at the adaptation guide, the California Planning Adaptation Guide from 2020, which has a lot of examples. And we're a bit more flexible. The only thing is we have some explicit ineligible activities, such as the implementation of construction projects and environmental studies and plans, such as the CEQA and NEPA process. So for funding targets, similar to round one, we really recognize the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities and commit to an equitable distribution of funds through specific funding targets. Those funding targets are specifically for or intended for California Native American tribes, disadvantaged communities, popularly referred to as DACs, and small and rural communities. And this is due to their increased vulnerability to climate risks with limited resources for coping, adapting to, and recovering from those climate risks. These groups face unique challenges and play a crucial role in enhancing the state's climate adaptation potential. The APGP team respects the sovereignty of California Native American tribes and has purposely designed this funding target and the program in general to not only aim to fund at least 3 projects led by tribes, but also provide maximum flexibility to meet their specific needs in climate adaptation. So from partnership requirements to incorporation of traditional knowledge to our contract administration, we're really trying to create a more accessible program. And then for the DAC funding target, at least 4 qualifying projects we're looking to fund that directly benefit disadvantaged communities. And DAC projects, to meet this requirement, the disadvantaged community must comprise 51% of the project applicant's combined jurisdiction. We have a few tools and definitions and resources in the draft guidelines, and we're hoping to develop a specific tool to make identification of this funding target easier for folks. And you'll see later when we talk about technical assistance how we're thinking about this. And small and rural communities are also a funding target. In California, smaller, more rural communities often face unique climate adaptation challenges, such as physical isolation, dependence on natural resources, and economic diversification challenges. So we're really hoping to award 3 projects from these communities as well. And you'll be able to see a tool linked in the guidelines, and we'll put that in the chat as well, for how we're thinking about small and rural communities. Application support is also available to assist prospective applicants in determining their eligibility for these funding targets. Abby will share more about this later in the presentation. I really just also want to emphasize that it's important to note these are not the only projects that the APGP will fund. These projects will just be prioritized through our scoring criteria and technical assistance, but we're not excluding applications from other types of communities. Next slide, please. So in round 1, we had some of these core components to the program, but we weren't as explicit. So for round 2, we want to include a bit more specificity around partnership requirements, how we're thinking about prioritizing vulnerable communities, plan alignment, and some more resources and guidance around long-term funding. The first core project component is centered on partnership. Either the lead or one of the co-applicants should be a public entity or a tribe. Community-based organizations should partner with local public entities or tribes as listed to ensure that planning efforts funded can ultimately be implemented by the local, regional, or tribal entities. And conversely, public entities should partner with community-based organizations to ensure that planning efforts are centering the needs of vulnerable communities. In each of these cases, we understand that one size does not fit all. And so in these cases, we accept justification as to why partnership with a public entity or with a community-based organization is not feasible. And you can see the guidelines for more details there. Next slide, please. So similar to last year, all applicants are urged to consider and address how their projects will serve members of vulnerable communities, including access and functional needs communities, which the acronym AFN on the screen refers to, tribal communities, rural communities, and disadvantaged communities. Disparities in vulnerable communities can arise from various factors, and so we really are encouraging our applicants to sort of think through who are these vulnerable communities and sort of provide tools to help them identify and recognize these communities. Each applicant is also encouraged to use a combination of two tools to see maybe different aspects of vulnerability within their communities. And we provide a list of those tools in the guidelines as well. And then there's additional resources in the appendix for folks. It's our understanding that by addressing these points, our projects can effectively convey the importance of considering and addressing vulnerable communities in their project planning, and also provide information. We are hoping to provide more information on those tools as well, and we can discuss that a little bit later as well when we get to the technical assistance bit. Projects should also align with their jurisdiction and with statewide goals and policies. But we also acknowledge that not all plans or goals are sort of like perfect, and they may require updating. And so we suggest that folks, if they're deviating from expressed jurisdictional goals and policies, that they just explain sort of how and why their project is deviating, and how it still aligns with the adaptation planning grant program's priorities. And then projects also should align with the best available science. So we're thinking the California climate change assessments, the CalAdapt tool, which is updated with the latest climate projections, and then traditional knowledge for our communities should all be considered as additional as resources where we can come to understand what's the best available in science. And there's additional resources in Appendix E as well. And lastly, to ensure project sustainability, we believe it's crucial to integrate state and federal infrastructure grant alignment and financing solutions into our adaptation planning projects. And by strategically integrating state and federal infrastructure grants or other financing solutions into climate adaptation planning, communities can really unlock more sustainable funding mechanisms that extend beyond the initial project phase. And this will ensure ongoing support for resilience efforts long-term. And with that, I'll hand it back to Abby to talk through the application process and some key changes that we're thinking through.
All right, thanks, Brandon. And thanks everyone for your engagement. I know this is a lot of information. It's early after a 3-day weekend, so hopefully you're with us. And I'm just going to talk briefly through the application process. So for those of you who joined us last round, you'll see that some of it is pretty similar, but there are some key changes to note. So for this round, we're going to be using a platform called Submittable. So for those of you that are familiar with OPR grants or SGC grants, you'll notice that we've all transitioned to this platform. We are by no means the first program that's going through it, and so there's been a lot of lessons learned. And so hopefully it'll be a pretty smooth process. So for applicants, applicants will submit a pre-application interest form. So last round we called it an intent survey, same idea. We encourage you to fill this out as soon as possible. And for those that are seeking technical assistance, which I'll touch on in a minute, there is a priority deadline for pre-application interest form. It's important to know that these pre-application interest forms are not scored. They're just used as a point of contact for staff, and we will use it to provide any initial direction or feedback, and then also to send you the full application materials. So once the pre-application is submitted, applicants will gain access to the full application materials, and we also will provide templates of what is in Submittable, since collaboration on the platform can be challenging, because one entity will end up submitting all of the application materials on behalf of the applicants. And then the application review process will look really similar to how it looked last time. It includes eligibility checks, scoring by an interagency review panel, final interviews for top scoring applicants, leading to award recommendations by APGP staff to submit to the governor's office, and hopefully final awards summer 2024. We'll share a link to the submittable platform. This is just their general website, just in case you wanted to get familiar with them. And then when we have our application window open, we'll be doing a more hands-on walkthrough of the platform, of the pre-application interest form, of the full application, just to give you all a sense of what to expect. And the next section, our scoring criteria also hasn't changed substantially, but we've definitely refined it and clarified any areas that were confusing. So we have our project vision and description. So this one is up to 15 points, and it's to present a comprehensive project overview, including key program components, partnerships, and alignment with climate adaptation goals. The next one is the community need and adaptive capacity. So that's up to 30 points. And this is describing the existing information about vulnerable communities, their involvement, and how the project will address their needs. The co-benefit section is up to 10 points, and that explains how the project prioritizes strategies providing climate adaptation co-benefits. The next one is the community partnership, and that's up to 20 points. And that describes the organizations that are involved, their roles, the partnership structure, and that will be scored based on community support and readiness. And then the last section, or the last two, so there's the work plan and the budget, and that's up to 15 points. And that's sort of a comprehensive work plan, timelines, and the budget allocated, demonstrating alignment with the program objectives and implementation. And then the last one is a final interview, and that's up to 10 points. So the top scoring applicants will participate in a finalist interview and earn points based on the clarity of the vision, alignment with the program priorities, strength of the partnership, and addressing the questions that we may have for them. So in the guidelines in Appendix E, you'll see a very detailed scoring criteria of how we're intending to allocate high, medium, and low scores for each of these sections. I think it'll give you a real sense of what we're hoping to see through the applications. And so definitely reference Appendix E. There's lots of information in there, and definitely hoping to get comments from you all too on this if there's any areas that aren't clear. So on to technical assistance that we've been alluding to this whole time. We have civics on the line with us to answer any questions during the Q&A portion. But we're really excited to offer technical assistance for round two. It's one of the biggest areas of feedback we got for round one was you all as staff can help us to some extent, but there's a lot that we can't do. And so third-party technical assistance can really help remove some barriers for applicants in applying to the program. And so we're super happy to have this TA provider. We're sharing this contract with all of the ICARP grant programs. So you'll be interacting with the same organization, and it'll hopefully be a pretty streamlined experience for those that are seeking technical assistance. So we mentioned this before, but for APGP, the priority for technical assistance will be given to applicants from funding target communities that Brandon outlined. So that includes California Native American tribes, disadvantaged communities, and small and rural communities. You'll see that all in the guidelines, but worth noting here. And applicants that are interested in getting technical assistance should submit the pre-application interest form by March 15th. I know that's kind of coming around. I guess it's 2 months out. And again, that pre-application interest form is not scored. Really just a touch point to understand the project, understand the partners and the needs. And then it will help us be able to prioritize the technical assistance requests as they come in. And then really that early submission really ensures that we'll be able to make the most of the technical assistance and then also make the most of support from staff, because there are a lot of things that Brandon, Sarah, and I can support folks on. So we will partner with the TA provider to really tailor the assistance to the applicant's needs. So we're working with the TA provider to really help define the scope and scale and timeline of the direct application TA. Once those forms are submitted, the pre-application interest form, and we make a note of all the applications that came through, OPR will notify applicants of their prioritized assistance status. We have to note that, while some applicants may receive technical assistance, that does not guarantee an award. The APGP process is a competitive grant process, and we expect the same to be the case for round two. So just wanting to emphasize that engaging with a TA provider early on will ensure success, but success is not guaranteed. And then the last slide, we just wanted to note, this is not comprehensive of the services that will be provided, but support can be from the TA provider on clarification of requirements and the guidelines during the application development, provision of frameworks and tools and templates for APGP applicant use in the proposals, and then direct assistance, so including answering TA questions, reviewing proposed responses, and providing any sort of general partnership support or feedback. So those are some of the general things. Obviously, as we continue to refine the scope with the TA provider, and you all submit your interest forms, more will be clarified based on what your needs are as the applicant, and what services the TA provider can provide. So as a high-level overview, the next thing that's a big change for this round is advanced payment. So if you all have tracked, maybe or maybe not, AB 590 was passed, which is a huge win, an exciting win, and it basically authorized all state agencies that administer grant programs that they can provide up to 25% of the total grant awards and advance payments to grant recipients that are nonprofit organizations. So OPR may grant advance payment exceeding 25% of the grant award if OPR determines that the project requires a larger advance payment. And you'll see in the guidelines, there are some requirements for the 501c3s, including itemized budget, documentation, reports. Some of this is being finalized with our legal team on what requirements OPR will have. So any comments on this section would be helpful in helping inform those requirements. And we're also hoping to just closely align those requirements with the general requirements of the program to not make it be too burdensome on the applicant. But we're excited about this bill passing and excited to be able to offer it for round two. So this is our last slide, I believe. So this is a tentative timeline of what's coming up for us. So we have another workshop. I actually think it might be on the 25th, so apologies for that. It might be on the 24th. So Sarah, Brandon, please write in the chat, and you can add the registration form. It's going to look really similar to this workshop. And then February 2nd is when our public comment closes at 5 p.m. And you can submit comments at that email. You can also send us emails if you have any questions. As mentioned, March 15th is the priority deadline for the application technical assistance. February 12th through the 13th, May 13th is the application window, and that's tentative based on how many public comments we receive, how many changes we need to make to the final guidelines. But our anticipated application window is February 12th to the 13th, May 13th. And then May through July, we anticipate being under application review, interviews, and final deliberations. And then we anticipate announcing awards sometime in August. So that is our tentative timeline for the program. And we just wanted to open it up for any questions or comments that folks may have for us. We are happy to answer any, and we also can use the time to receive any public comments if folks have already been able to dive into the grant guidelines. And if you need extra time, you know where to find us. But yeah, I wanted to see if there's any questions that folks had. Please feel free to raise your hand. And we will call on you or add something in the chat, anything. And thanks all for your engagement so far. Yes, Greg, thank you for being brave and, and making asking a question.